This is an empty classroom. Empty for now. In just a few minutes, students will file in. Nervous, joking, anxious, about to sit a business studies exam. But underneath that uncertain exterior, there's quiet confidence. They feel prepared for whatever the exam is going to throw at them. Why is this the case? Well, it's because they watched all of Mr. Simons' videos about the 2020 Business Studies HSC exam, including the one that you're about to see, which looks at questions 23 and 24, the operations and finance short answer questions. So, without further ado, here... So here we are at question 23. Denim Jeans clothing store is concerned about declining sales. So I'll just put it over here and I'm saying, okay, so we're seeing they have identified that the lower sales are a result of, and we've got three things here. So we've got outdated store presentation, more foreign competition, and a reluctance to adopt modern in-store payment methods. So this is very helpful because we've got three things that we can then tackle. So the first part, 23A, gives us the indication about what KBF this whole question relates to. And so here, that question 23 is about operations. So the first part here, and that this is worth 4 marks, says, how could the strategic role of operations management help this business, assist this business? So that, to me, it's a bit of a complex question that kind of, so like, where do you even start? So what I would suggest is that you go back and you start thinking about the syllabus, and you've got here under the role, so the R part of operations, and that you've got strategic role of operations management, cost leadership, goods services differentiation. If we start by thinking about, well, what is the strategic role of operations management? Well, the role here is that we're trying to help the business function effectively. So to achieve its goals and its objectives. So for example, if we're thinking about a business, how can we help it produce the products that it needs to? Or how can we help it supply the services that are required, right? How can it achieve its goals and its objectives? And that's part of the role of operations management, is to help a business achieve that. In the context of this question, if we go a bit further, that what we're trying to understand is that, so for this specific business, and that's a criticism that I make of students often, is that their responses are quite general, and that in the context, if they've given us all of this information, we need to really target our answer to this particular business. And we're saying, how can operations help? So if we zoom out a little bit and we think about the role of operations management, that in the context of what we've been given, I think that differentiation is a good focus here. And the reason that I say this in terms of why I probably wouldn't discuss cost leadership is that if I go back to the stimulus, that what I would say, there's nothing in the stimulus about the issue of cost-based competition or any issues with the price of the product. Yes, there is greater foreign competition, but it's not clear that that's because of price or that price is the reason why sales are falling. So for me, in terms of thinking about these things, that I would be inclined to focus on differentiation for this business. So if we look down here and we think about, okay, for this business, how can operations help? That the point we're taking in terms of the strategic role of operations, the advantage of differentiation for this jeans business is that we can make the offering more appealing to customers. And that way that they would be inclined, hopefully, to buy more, which can increase sales, and then ultimately, as is the goal of any business, is to increase profitability, increase the amount of profit that this business makes. So if we then think about on this side, okay, so how can this business get involved in differentiation? And remember, our focus is on this business specifically, is that we can think about a few different options so that when we're trying to differentiate based on product, we could think about, well, maybe we could talk about what is the mix of products that is being sold by the business. So maybe that this particular business could increase the number of brands or the types of brands that are being done. Maybe this business could look at selling non-jeans products to expand in terms of markets. So let's just put these as little arrows here. And that maybe it could even look at, maybe it could be like an exclusive supplier of particular brands, so that the only way that customers can buy those jeans or products is to come to that business. The other thing is maybe that the business could look at the quality of its products. And so here it could maybe stock items that are of a much higher quality, and that could help differentiate it as well. That we don't exactly know what's wrong with the products itself, but if we're looking at the strategic role of operations and we're looking at cost leadership differentiation, I think the strong part here is differentiation, because we could do all of these things here and stand out from the foreign competition that has been identified in the stimulus. Okay, so I understand this is a bit confusing and a bit complex for 4 marks, but I think this is the kind of approach that will be useful. So let's just take this red pen and set out the process that we would do. Let's put blue, it's a little bit more friendly. So the way I would start is I would say, okay, let's set out the strategic role of operations, that it's there to help the business function effectively, and that we are looking between cost leadership and goods and services differentiation. So we're saying for this business, how can operations help? Our step 2 is saying, well, that for this business, the most important strategic role of operations is in terms of differentiation, that there is nothing in the stimulus or the discussion that has told us that price and cost-based issues are the drama. And then we would say, okay, so how would this business differentiate? We could talk about what are the products that it carries and maybe what is the quality that it carries. And you might say, Mr. Simons, these things are really related. And I would say, sure, they're pretty similar, but we just need to provide some examples of how this business would use operations to try and address its challenges and to try and boost sales. Okay, so part B, 6 marks, a lot on offer here for this question. So what I've done is I've just included the syllabus areas here. So you can see influences is here and strategies is here from the operations section. Okay, so the question reads, analyze operations strategies that could be used to address 2 operations influences affecting this business. So if I think about the direction of this question, what I'm saying is I have to think about how do operations strategies address 2 operations influences? That is the direction of this question. So if I'm trying to set it up here in terms of thinking about it, is I would say on this side, I would say, okay, so how do these operations strategies, and I would have my first influence and then I would have my second influence. I think if you can decode that that is what this question is looking for, it will make it much easier to answer it. So if we zoom out and we think about, well, what are the kind of influences that would be most useful to include? So let's put this in this greenish color. We'll say, okay, so we're looking here at these influences. So I think that technology is a good one because there is that discussion of outdated payment methods. So that would be a good influence to include. And so we've done one, and now we just need to do one more. Now, globalization, I think, would be a good one because we know that there is global competition coming in and that there are some strategies that could be quite relevant to talk about. I think there is also a discussion about quality expectations that you could use, because we know that the store layout is out of date and not what people are looking for. So that would be an option as well. I'm just not sure about cost-based competition in terms of influencers, because I haven't seen anything in the case study itself where it's like cost is the issue. That I know that competition is an issue, but not cost-based, no government, legal, environmental sustainability, not really. So if I'm trying to make my life simple, I would be inclined to say, yes, I will talk about technology and I will talk about globalization. And I'll show you why that makes sense to me. If I'm thinking about this here, is that, well, I could go to technology for technology. Because I could say here, oh yeah, we could talk about how the business, in order to deal with technology, that they could use leading edge technology, and they could also just use the straight up established technology. And that in terms of what I would discuss for each of these is that with the leading edge technology, I might talk about buy now, pay later, BNPL, buy now, pay later. Particularly the most well-known, I think, in this space would be Afterpay, so that you are then allowing the customers to have the goods now and pay later. And that is a very modern form of payment, very modern, because we know that we're thinking about here is that the key thing is we are trying to make the payment methods much more modern and contemporary. So leading edge technology, we could allow people to buy now, pay later, including through the use of Afterpay. Established, maybe we can allow people to use credit cards or debit cards. I mean, it probably already is something they use, but maybe it's there. Maybe you could also talk about, well, we could allow them to use PayPal, other sort of more established options here. By modernizing payment here, that what we are trying to do is we're trying to improve the customer experience so that there's no obstacles or roadblocks when it comes to pay, that it's pretty easy to do, and therefore that would hopefully increase sales. So we're saying that we would use leading edge technology and established technology to deal with the influence of technology. And here, that specifically this technology being out of date. I'm not saying, just use technology to deal with technology. I'm saying use leading edge and established technology to deal with out of date, inferior technology in terms of payments. If I scroll back out here and I say, okay, so let's go to globalization. What I'll do is I'll just erase quality expectations so we just don't get confused here, so that when I'm talking about globalization here, that I would be very much looking at global factors for here. So that would be here. So that the influence in terms of globalization is that I would be talking about here that we've got globalization, that we've got foreign competition coming through, and that in the context of that, we are having falling sales. So that we're saying to the business that the business has to address the challenges posed by foreign competition. So if we zoom out a little bit and we think about, okay, so what strategies would we use here? That I think that I would talk about things like global sourcing in terms of products. And I think scanning and learning would also be useful, because maybe we could copy the successful things that work overseas in terms of stores and also products. So that, in talking about the strategies, so that one would be global sourcing, and that here we're looking at new and hot, probably in demand is a better way to explain it, products from overseas, and that will hopefully increase sales by giving customers more options. The other thing is to talk about scanning and learning, where we can look at what's happening overseas and copy and adopt successful approaches from overseas. I think a really good way to link this to the stimulus is to say, could look at what successful stores are doing overseas and bring those approaches back for this business. So if I just zoom back out and we do a bit of a summary here, is that the key part is being able to say, okay, I have to look at what strategies can be used to address two influences. So I've got the two influences here and the strategies on this side. Just put a little bit of a line going down here to separate it out. So the strategies are on this side and the influences are on this side. So we've got the setup here. Before I would even go into the actual parts, is I would annotate some of these things here. So I've got sales and then I've got COGS, right? I've got all of the expenses put together here. So then I've got accounts receivable here. That's separate from expenses there, and this being a current asset. And then I've got a couple of other things here. I've got the robotics company credit policy of 30 days. And so that I might be thinking, oh, okay, so that's could relate to the accounts receivable turnover ratio and the kind of days that would be on offer. And then I've got the industry expense ratio of 10%. So then that's got me thinking, okay, maybe there would be some comparative ratio analysis in this question as well. So I've got all of that set up and I'm just kind of thinking, okay, where could this be taken? What kind of things are they going to ask now? First part, 1 mark. Calculate the accounts receivable turnover ratio for this business. Okay, so let's work that out, shall we? So we've got the formula there, which is obviously very kind of them. So accounts receivable turnover ratio equals sales over accounts receivable. So in this context, then that would be 225,000, okay, over 30K would give us 7.5. Now, it hasn't specifically asked for things in terms of days, but I think it would be really useful because we've got a measure of days in here. So what we would say then is accounts receivable turnover ratio in days would equal 365, as in the rough days in a year, divided by the number of times accounts receivable turns over, and this would give me 49 days. So I'm not going to give the interpretation here because it's just calculate. But what I'm thinking in my head is I'm thinking, okay, well, the terms are 30 days, but actually it's taking 49 days to collect accounts receivable so that it's not achieving its goal there. But for the context of this question, that this 49 days will be your answer. Second question is a little bit more tricky, and it has this directive term interpret. So it says interpret this business's expense ratio, total expenses divided by sales. So the first thing we would do is if we're thinking about this idea of interpret, we're really trying to clarify, well, what does this figure mean? We are trying to give the value of the expense ratio a little bit of context. So we'll just put this here so we don't confuse it with answering it. So then I would say, okay, so the expense ratio would equal the total expenses, which here is going to be 8,500 plus admin expenses of 6,000 plus financial expenses of 4,000 divided by total sales, which is 225,000. And then this will then equal 0.082. And then if I just times that by 100, I'm going to get 8.2%. Okay, so I've got the figure. Let's just put a little barrier around this so we don't get it confused. So I've got the number, but now I need to provide a little bit of that interpretation. So if I've got 8.2%, so what I'm saying here is that then for every $1 in sales, the business has 8 cents in expenses, right? And the expense ratio here would be 8.2%. So that's part of the interpretation. What you could also say, just to make sure that those 2 marks are yours. So we could say that the expense ratio for this business is 8.2%. And this is below the industry average. If I scroll back out in terms of this question, that you can see that the industry expense ratio is 10%. So this business is performing better than the industry in terms of a lower expense ratio. So I think that if you put all of this information together, that it would be very hard to see you not getting that full 2 marks. Recommend one financial strategy this business could implement to improve efficiency in the collection of accounts receivable. So that if I'm thinking about answering this question, that what I would do is I'd say, okay, so there's 3 marks on offer, and that I have to identify one strategy. So if I'm thinking about how would I allocate those 3 marks, or how would a marker go about allocating those, is I'd be like, okay, well then, which strategy are you talking about? What's the definition or the characteristics of that strategy? And how does that strategy work? That would be the kind of thing that I would be thinking about. So if I bring this across a little bit, so then I would be saying, okay, so one good example I think would be the use of factoring. And this is not a perfect response. These are kind of just the elements that I think would be very good to include. So we say, okay, so factoring. Okay, so the strategy is factoring. In terms of what it is, that the business will sell the value of its accounts receivable to a finance company at a discount, right? So then the finance company, they will go off and they will collect the accounts receivable, and the business will get this immediate injection of funds, that the business does not have to waste effort in chasing up the debtors, the people that owe the business money, and this would be much more efficient because there isn't that wasted effort. The key thing that I think you should mention is that, say for this business, accounts receivable is 30K. And I'm not making that up. If we go back to the table, you can see here accounts receivable is 30,000. So what I might say is I say, okay, the value of accounts receivable is 30,000. Let's say that the finance company charges a fee of 10% of the value. So then the business will get an immediate injection of $27,000 in cash. Right? And that has definitely sped up the collection of accounts receivable because the money is coming straight through and there is no wasted effort. But yes, it does cost money. So here, the recommend part, right? So the key thing here is that it's no wasted effort there. We don't have to talk about the negatives in terms of what are the consequences of giving up 10% of accounts receivable here. That's kind of how I think those marks would break down. Explain 2 ways in which comparative ratio analysis can be used by this business to assess its financial position. Okay, so we're thinking about what are 2 ways that the business can use comparative ratio analysis to figure out where its financial position sits in the scheme of things. So I think that there are 2 ways that I would generally talk about comparative ratio analysis. So I'll put one over here and then we'll put one in this color here. So the first way I could think about is that one, I would use it to compare against other businesses. And then on this side, I would use that ratio analysis to compare against different time periods. So let's go back to step 1 here. So what we could say is that we're trying to figure out against other businesses, what is the business's relative performance, right? So for example, with an expense ratio of 8.2%, that we might wonder that is this good? Should we maintain that? Would it be okay to have more expenses? What we can do is we can take this, compare it to the industry, which in our example here is 10%, and we can see either that we are more efficient than the industry, and or there could actually be scope to increase expenses slightly, which could help in terms of increasing growth of the business. But we wouldn't know that if we didn't compare it to another business. So we're trying to compare our relative performance and even our relative success. And that in order to do that, to really understand that, we need a comparison. We can't just say, yeah, this is really great, our expense ratio is quite low, if we don't have something to compare it against. So we're saying, what is the standard in the industry? Are we performing well as a business, or do we need to improve? And the ratio analysis is giving us the evidence to be able to answer those questions. Move over here, and we can also think about, well, we use comparative ratio analysis to compare against different time periods. So what do I mean by that? And I would, as much as possible, try and find examples from the stimulus in this. So we could say that at present, the accounts receivable turnover ratio is 49 days. And in terms of where I got that information from, that just comes from part A of this question. But we know that the company's credit policy is 30 days. Again, that comes from, well, not part A, that comes from the table at the start of the question. So what we can say is that because 49 days is greater than 30, that we might say, okay, do we need to take action? Do we need to actually put in place some accounts receivable turnover ratio strategies? And that part of the way we can answer that question is we can compare it with the past. So what we could do is go back to the historical ratios in terms of comparative ratio analysis, and we could say, oh, you know what? At this time of year, it's always higher because of this reason. And so therefore, we don't need to take action because it always works like that. So here, if we're thinking about consistently higher, is we might say, okay, so therefore, don't take any action. Alternatively, if the ratio analysis here doesn't have a track record, if we sort of say, no, actually, this is a one-off and this is far too high, then we can say, all right, now it is time to take action because this is not something that usually happens. And the way that we've done that is we've compared it against different time periods to collect the evidence. So if I scroll out a bit here, you can see that it's a 4-mark question and that I would be looking at 2 by 2 in the sense of that this side, that this would be 2 marks and this would be 2 marks. So really, if I say, what is the way and why is it important, that should be sufficient in terms of getting those 2 marks for each side of this question. This is Kevin. Kevin's an excellent business studies student, but this wasn't always the case. Kevin is an excellent business studies student because he consistently works on his weaknesses. Honestly, he was not very good at finance questions. But you know what? He sought out finance questions, completed them to the best of his ability, and checked with his teacher for feedback. Now, Kevin's cooking with the best of them when exams roll around. So, be like Kevin.